Pastor Jonathan Matthews held the ornate Virgin Mary statue above the roaring flames, his hands trembling with righteous fury. 300 congregants watched in stunned silence as their beloved pastor prepared to destroy what he called the greatest deception in Christian history. But as the carved wooden face drew closer to the fire, something impossible began to happen. Tears started flowing from the Virgin's painted eyes, and what followed next would shake every soul in that Alabama church to its very core. The morning worship service at Covenant Light Evangelical Church had started like any other Sunday. The red brick building buzzed with the familiar sounds of fellowship, children laughing, coffee brewing, and congregation members greeting each other with warm Southern hospitality. But hidden beneath Pastor Matthews' sermon notes lay a secret that would transform this ordinary service into something extraordinary. What you're about to witness is the most controversial religious event ever recorded in modern America. A pastor's crisis of faith, a congregation divided, and divine intervention that defies all explanation. Stay with us as we uncover a story that will challenge everything you believe about God's mercy and justice. The 18-inch wooden statue had appeared on the church doorstep 3 days earlier, wrapped in white linen with a simple note, "For those seeking Mary's intercession." Pastor Matthews, at 54 years old and 30 years in ministry, saw it as a direct attack on his Protestant theology. To him, Catholic veneration of Mary represented idolatry, worship stolen from Christ himself. Sarah Wilson, a devoted member for 15 years, sat in her usual third-row pew with her 17-year-old daughter Emma. The divorced mother had found stability in Pastor Matthews' clear biblical teachings, but something about today felt different. The air itself seemed charged with electricity that made her skin prickle. Dr. Robert Hayes, the church's head deacon and a respected surgeon, noticed his pastor's agitation immediately. In 12 years of serving together, he'd never seen Matthews this visibly shaken. The brass brazier beside the pulpit, brought in specifically for today's service, filled him with growing dread about what was planned. "Today we confront the enemy of truth itself," Pastor Matthews announced, his voice echoing through the sanctuary. "This statue represents centuries of deception that has led millions away from Christ. Before your eyes, we will demonstrate God's judgment on false worship." Emma Wilson stared at the beautiful carved figure and felt her heart break. Despite her Protestant upbringing, she'd always been drawn to Mary's courage, a teenage girl who said yes to an impossible calling. The statue's serene expression spoke of pure love, not the evil her pastor described. As Pastor Matthews lifted the statue toward the flames, no one could have predicted that heaven itself was about to intervene in the most dramatic way possible. The moment Pastor Matthews raised the Virgin Mary statue above the brazier's dancing flames, the impossible began. What had been carved, lifeless, would suddenly display the first sign of divine intervention. A single tear appeared at the corner of the Virgin's painted eye, glistening like liquid diamonds in the sanctuary's light. "Dear God," whispered Mrs. Eleanor Kraft, an 80-year-old founding member. Her weathered hands flew to her chest as she watched the tear grow larger, defying every law of physics she understood. Dr. Hayes instinctively reached for his phone to document what was happening, his medical training demanding evidence. But as he focused his camera on the statue, more tears began flowing, not the slow seepage of moisture through wood, but genuine weeping that spoke of immeasurable sorrow. Pastor Matthews felt the first droplet fall onto his hand and gasped. The tear was warm, almost burning, but not with heat, with an intensity of emotion that penetrated straight to his soul. For 30 years, he'd preached about God's presence, but he'd never experienced anything like this tangible touch of the divine. "It's crying," Emma Wilson said, her voice cutting through the congregation's stunned silence. "She's crying because you want to hurt her." The teenager's words hit Pastor Matthews like physical blows. He'd spent 3 days preparing his sermon on the dangers of Marian devotion, gathering scripture after scripture to justify what he was about to do. But the tears falling from the statue's eyes spoke a different truth, one that challenged everything he'd built his ministry upon. Sarah Wilson felt her own eyes filling with tears as she watched the miracle unfold. The peace emanating from the weeping statue was unlike anything she'd experienced in 15 years of faithful attendance. This wasn't the stern, judgmental God she'd been taught to fear. This was pure maternal love grieving over division among her children. The fragrance began subtly, like the memory of a grandmother's garden. Rose petals and lily blossoms seemed to bloom in the very air of the sanctuary, though no flowers were present. Several congregation members looked around in confusion, wondering if someone had brought elaborate arrangements they'd somehow missed. But the weeping was only the beginning. What happened next would force Pastor Matthews to choose between his theological pride and the undeniable evidence of divine presence filling his church. Dr. Hayes zoomed in with his phone camera, capturing tears that seemed to glow with their own internal light. As a man of science, he searched desperately for rational explanations, hidden mechanisms, chemical reactions, mass hysteria. But his medical expertise told him he was witnessing something that transcended natural law. As Pastor Matthews continued to hold the weeping statue above the flames, the wooden features began to transform before the congregation's amazed eyes. The carved face, which had been beautiful but static, suddenly seemed to breathe with life itself. The Virgin's eyes moved with fluid grace, looking upon each person in the sanctuary with infinite compassion. The tears flowed more freely now, falling onto the brass brazier and causing the flames to hiss and steam. Where the miraculous droplets touched fire, the flames didn't just diminish, they transformed into something that looked more like liquid light than ordinary combustion. "Pastor, please stop," called out Thomas Miller, a construction foreman whose calloused hands trembled as he gripped his pew. "Can't you see God is trying to tell us something?" But Pastor Matthews found himself paralyzed by conflicting emotions. His theological training screamed that this had to be deception, Satan appearing as an angel of light to fool the faithful. Yet the presence he was experiencing felt more holy, more genuinely divine, than anything in his 3 decades of ministry. Emma Wilson stood up, her 17-year-old frame straight with conviction that surprised even herself. "She's not asking us to worship her," the teenager declared, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed sanctuary. "She's showing us how to worship him, with tears of love, not flames of anger." What's happening in this Alabama church is testing the faith of everyone present in ways they never imagined. The most shocking revelation is about to unfold as the Virgin Mary delivers a message that will change their understanding of divine love forever. The statue's lips began to move in what appeared to be silent prayer, and though no audible words filled the sanctuary, each person present heard a message specifically meant for their heart. For Sarah Wilson, it was forgiveness for the bitterness she'd carried since her divorce. For Dr. Hayes, it was healing from the guilt he'd harbored over patients he couldn't save. Mrs. Kraft heard something that brought her decades of secret shame into the light. The Catholic prayers she'd learned as a child and never forgotten, despite years of Protestant teaching that such devotions were wrong. The Virgin's message to her was simple: all sincere prayer reaches heaven, regardless of the words used. Pastor Matthews received the most challenging message of all. As he held the weeping statue, visions flashed through his mind. Centuries of Christians finding comfort through Mary's intercession, mothers praying for their children, soldiers seeking protection, families finding hope in their darkest hours. He saw that what he'd called idolatry was actually a river of love flowing toward Christ through his mother's compassionate heart. The fragrance of roses intensified until it seemed the entire sanctuary had been transformed into a heavenly garden. People began approaching the altar spontaneously, drawn by an irresistible pull toward the source of such overwhelming peace and love. Young Emma reached out tentatively and touched one of the statue's tears as it fell. The luminous droplet felt warm and somehow alive, filling her with a joy she'd never experienced. Her depression, her teenage angst, her questions about faith, all of it dissolved in that moment of contact with divine grace. As more congregation members approached the front of the church, the division that Pastor Matthews had tried to create began healing itself through the Virgin's tears. People who had come expecting to witness the destruction of Catholic idolatry instead found themselves encountering the very presence of God in a form they'd never expected. Dr. Hayes continued documenting everything, but his role as an objective observer was becoming impossible to maintain. The tears falling from the statue weren't just defying physics. They were healing hearts, mending relationships, and answering prayers that some people had carried for decades. "I can smell my mother's garden," whispered Janet Reynolds, a nurse whose mother had died 5 years earlier. "She always grew roses for the Virgin Mary, even though Daddy said it was Catholic nonsense." She was right, wasn't she? Mary really does care about us. Pastor Matthews watched his congregation responding to the miracle and felt his own heart breaking, not from sorrow, but from the expansion of understanding that was almost too much to bear. For 30 years, he'd preached about God's love while building walls between denominations. Now he was seeing that divine love transcended every boundary human beings tried to create. The statue's tears had formed a small pool at the base of the brazier, and the liquid continued to glow with supernatural light. Several people knelt and touched the miraculous tears to their foreheads, making signs of the cross, gestures that would have horrified them an hour earlier but now felt like the most natural expressions of reverence. Emma Wilson found herself praying words she'd never learned. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." The prayer rose from her heart without conscious thought, as if the Virgin herself was teaching her how to speak to heaven through a mother's intercession. Pastor Matthews now faces the most crucial decision of his entire ministry. Will he complete his planned destruction of the statue, or will he acknowledge that God is speaking through this miraculous manifestation? His choice will determine not just his own spiritual future, but the faith journey of his entire congregation. Sarah Wilson approached her pastor with tears streaming down her face. "Jonathan," she said, using his first name for the first time in 15 years, "I think we've been wrong about some things. I think God's love is bigger than our theology." The words hit Pastor Matthews like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He built his entire ministry on being right about doctrine, on protecting his congregation from what he saw as Catholic errors. But the presence he was experiencing now was teaching him that divine truth was larger and more beautiful than any human understanding could contain. Mrs. Kraft began singing softly, her elderly voice carrying a melody most of the congregation didn't recognize, "Ave Maria, gratia plena." But somehow, the Latin words felt familiar to their hearts, as if they'd been waiting their whole lives to hear this ancient prayer of praise. Pastor Matthews felt the statue growing warm in his hands, not with the heat of the flames below, but with something deeper and more profound, the warmth of perfect love that cast out all fear. The Virgin's tears continued to fall, and where they touched his skin, he experienced healing from wounds he hadn't even realized he carried. His childhood trauma from growing up in poverty, the pressure of maintaining his reputation as a successful pastor, the secret doubts about his faith that had plagued him for years, all of it began to dissolve in the presence of such overwhelming compassion. "I don't know what to do," he admitted to his congregation, his voice breaking with emotion. "Everything I've taught you, everything I've believed about proper worship, it's being challenged by what I'm experiencing right now." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his phone still recording the unprecedented event. "Pastor," he said gently, "maybe the question isn't whether this fits our theology. Maybe the question is whether our theology is big enough for this." The surgeon's words carried weight throughout the sanctuary. Here was a man of science, trained to trust only verifiable evidence, acknowledging that they were witnessing something that transcended rational explanation. Emma Wilson approached the altar and knelt before the weeping statue. "She's not trying to replace Jesus," the teenager said with wisdom beyond her years. "She's trying to bring us closer to him, just like any good mother would." The statue's tears seemed to respond to Emma's words, flowing more freely and carrying an even more intense fragrance of roses and lilies. Several congregation members reported later that they heard what sounded like a lullaby, a wordless song of such beauty that it seemed to come from heaven itself. As Pastor Matthews struggled with the most important decision of his life, the Virgin Mary was about to deliver her most powerful message yet, one that would unite Catholic and Protestant hearts in a way that seemed impossible just hours earlier. Pastor Matthews closed his eyes and found himself praying not the formal prayers he'd learned in seminary, but words that poured directly from his heart. "Mary, if you can hear me, if this is really you, help me understand what you want from us. Help me know how to lead these people in truth." The response came not as words, but as a flood of understanding that filled his mind with clarity. He saw that honoring Mary didn't diminish Christ, it magnified him. He understood that the Virgin's role wasn't to compete with her Son, but to draw all souls closer to his sacred heart through her own immaculate heart. The brazier's flames began to die down naturally, as if the sacred presence in the sanctuary had transformed the very atmosphere from one of destruction to one of creation and healing. As Pastor Matthews held the weeping statue, he experienced what mystics throughout history have called direct divine communication. The Virgin Mary's message came not as words, but as pure understanding that flooded his consciousness with truth too beautiful for human language to fully express. He saw the centuries of division between Catholic and Protestant Christianity as a wound in the heart of Christ himself. He understood that the Virgin Mary wept not just for the statue that was nearly destroyed, but for all the division, hatred, and misunderstanding that had separated Christians who should be united in their love for her Son. "She's asking us to heal the divisions," Pastor Matthews announced to his congregation, his voice filled with awe. "All of us, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, we're all her children. We're all beloved by Christ. She doesn't want us to fight about her, she wants us to love each other through her." The transformation in the sanctuary was palpable. People who had entered that morning certain in their theological positions found themselves open to possibilities they'd never considered. The weeping statue had become a bridge between worlds that had seemed irreconcilably different. Dr. Hayes captured the moment when the statue's carved features seemed to smile, not with painted lips, but with an expression of such joy and peace that several congregation members fell to their knees in spontaneous worship. The medical professional in him knew he was documenting something that would challenge scientific understanding for generations to come. Sarah Wilson found herself embracing Mrs. Kraft, whose tears of joy were mixing with her own. "I always wondered what it would be like to pray the rosary," Sarah admitted. "Could you teach me?" The elderly woman nodded eagerly, pulling out a set of worn wooden beads she'd kept hidden in her purse for 60 years. "I never thought I'd be able to share these again," she whispered. But Mary knew. She always knew this day would come. The miracle at Covenant Light Evangelical Church is reaching its climax, but the most profound changes are yet to come. What happens next will transform not just one congregation, but will send ripples of healing throughout the entire Christian community. Emma Wilson stood before the statue and made a decision that would change the course of her life. "I want to study theology," she announced. "I want to help heal the divisions between Christian churches. I want to help people understand that love is bigger than our differences." The statue's tears began to slow, and Pastor Matthews realized that the miraculous visitation was drawing to a close. But the changes it had wrought in human hearts would last forever. "We're going to do things differently from now on," he told his congregation. "We're going to focus on what unites us with all Christians, not what divides us. We're going to honor Mary as the mother of our Savior and our spiritual mother too." The fragrance of roses lingered in the sanctuary long after the statue's features returned to their original carved appearance. But the pool of luminous tears at the base of the altar continued to glow, serving as a permanent reminder of the day heaven touched earth in rural Alabama. In the days following the miraculous event at Covenant Light Evangelical Church, word spread throughout the Christian community like wildfire. Pastor Matthews found himself at the center of a controversy that reached far beyond his small Alabama congregation, but he faced it with a peace he'd never known before. Some evangelical leaders criticized him harshly for embracing what they saw as Catholic heresy. But others, intrigued by the documented evidence of the miracle, began asking deeper questions about the rigid boundaries that had divided Christianity for centuries. Dr. Hayes' video footage became the most analyzed religious document of the modern era. Scientists, theologians, and skeptics examined every frame, searching for evidence of fraud or manipulation. But the evidence consistently supported the witnesses' testimony. They had witnessed something that defied natural explanation. The statue itself was examined by experts from around the world. Wood specialists confirmed that carved wood could not produce the tears that had been documented. Chemical analysis of the preserved tears revealed a substance unlike anything in scientific literature, organic in nature, but exhibiting properties that seemed to transcend physical law. Emma Wilson became a spokesperson for Christian unity, sharing her experience with youth groups, college campuses, and interfaith organizations. Her story of a Protestant teenager finding spiritual truth through the Virgin Mary inspired thousands of young people to look beyond denominational boundaries. Sarah Wilson organized the church's first ecumenical outreach program, reaching out to local Catholic parishes to build bridges of understanding and cooperation. The response was overwhelmingly positive, leading to joint worship services, shared community projects, and ongoing theological dialogue. But the most profound changes were yet to come, as the miracle's influence began transforming the broader Christian community in ways no one could have anticipated. Cardinal Michael Stevens from the Archdiocese of Birmingham visited Covenant Light Evangelical Church and knelt in prayer before the statue that had wept. His presence at a Protestant service made international headlines and opened doors for unprecedented cooperation between Catholic and evangelical communities. Pastor Matthews found himself invited to speak at Catholic parishes, Orthodox churches, and Protestant denominations across the country. His message was always the same: divine love is larger than human theology, and the Virgin Mary calls all Christians to unity in her Son. 1 year after the miraculous weeping of the Virgin Mary statue, Covenant Light Evangelical Church had become a pilgrimage destination for Christians from around the world. The small Alabama congregation had grown from 300 to over 1,000 members, representing dozens of different denominations united in their desire to experience the healing power of Christian unity. Pastor Matthews, now 55, had been transformed from a rigid denominational defender into a bridge builder between Christian traditions. His book, When Heaven Weeps, A Pastor's Journey from Division to Unity, became a bestseller and required reading in seminary courses across denominational lines. Dr. Hayes established the Institute for Scientific Study of Religious Phenomena, where the miracle at Covenant Light served as the founding case study. His work attracted researchers from Harvard, Oxford, and the Vatican, all seeking to understand the intersection between divine intervention and measurable reality. Emma Wilson, now 18 and preparing for college, had been accepted to study theology at both Catholic University and several Protestant seminaries. Her goal was to become an ordained minister dedicated to healing the wounds between Christian churches, a calling that began with a teenager's courage to speak truth to authority during a miraculous moment. Sarah Wilson led the church's new ministry of reconciliation, helping divorced and separated families find healing through the same divine love that had transformed their congregation. Her own journey from bitterness to joy became a template for others seeking to rebuild their lives after devastating losses. The Virgin Mary statue, permanently enshrined in a place of honor at Covenant Light Evangelical Church, continued to inspire prayer and meditation among visitors from every Christian tradition. While it never again wept visible tears, those who approached it with sincere hearts often reported feeling an overwhelming sense of peace and maternal love. Pastor Matthews often reflected on the morning he had planned to burn what he saw as an idol, only to discover it was actually a doorway to deeper truth. "I thought I was protecting God from false worship," he would tell visitors, "but God was protecting me from false understanding." The pool of luminous tears, preserved in a crystal reliquary, continued to glow with supernatural light, serving as a tangible reminder that the sacred can interrupt the ordinary at any moment. Scientific analysis could never fully explain the substance, but faith could experience its transformative power. The miracle had taught them that unity didn't require uniformity, that honoring Mary enhanced rather than diminished devotion to Christ, and that divine love was patient enough to work through human mistakes and misunderstandings to achieve its purposes. Dr. Hayes kept the original video recording in a climate-controlled vault, but copies have been viewed millions of times around the world, inspiring countless people to reconsider their assumptions about religious truth and divine intervention. Emma Wilson's teenage declaration, "She's not asking us to worship her, she's showing us how to worship him," had become a motto for the growing ecumenical movement that traced its inspiration to that extraordinary Sunday morning in Alabama. The greatest miracle, they all agreed, wasn't the weeping statue or the supernatural tears. It was the transformation of human hearts from division to unity, from fear to love, from theological pride to humble service. The story of Covenant Light Evangelical Church proves that God's love transcends all human boundaries and that divine intervention often comes in forms we least expect. Their journey from division to unity offers hope for healing in our fractured world. What barriers in your own life might God be calling you to tear down? What bridges might He be calling you to build? Share your thoughts on Christian unity and divine intervention in the comments below, and subscribe for more extraordinary stories of faith that transform hearts and change lives forever.